The words came without warning, without diplomatic softening, without the usual carefully crafted language that governments use when they want to threaten something, but still preserve the option of walking it back. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps spokesman stepped in front of the cameras and delivered a statement that instantly reverberated through every oil trading floor, every naval command center, and every foreign ministry from Washington to Beijing. He said with absolute clarity that if strikes against Iran continue, his country will not allow the export of a single liter of oil from the entire region. Not from Iran alone, not from Iranian-controlled waters alone. From the entire region, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, every tanker lane that carries roughly a fifth of all the oil that moves across the surface of this planet. The threat was not ambiguous, and the world understood it immediately. But here is what makes this moment genuinely different from the dozens of similar warnings that have come before it. This statement was not a standalone declaration made in isolation by a spokesperson trying to sound tough for domestic audiences. It was an escalation of something that had already been said just hours earlier by a senior Iranian military official, which means the messaging was coordinated, deliberate, and moving in one direction only, which is upward. And within hours of that statement reaching Washington, President Donald Trump fired back on social media with language that was equally unambiguous, warning that Iran would be struck, in his words, 20 times harder if it made any move to disrupt oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Two nuclear-adjacent powers, one already possessing nuclear weapons, and one reportedly on the verge of acquiring them, publicly threatening each other with devastating military consequences over the single most strategically important waterway in the global energy system. The world is watching and holding its breath. To understand why this exchange matters so deeply, and why some analysts are describing it as the most dangerous public escalation between Washington and Tehran in years, it is necessary to understand exactly what the Strait of Hormuz represents in purely physical and economic terms. The strait itself is a narrow stretch of water approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable point, sitting between the southern coast of Iran and the northern tip of Oman. Every single day, according to estimates from energy analysts and maritime tracking organizations, somewhere between 18 and 20 million barrels of crude oil and refined petroleum products pass through that choke point on their way to markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. That figure represents approximately 17 to 20% of all global oil trade. Saudi Arabia's exports flow through it. Iraq's exports flow through it. The United Arab Emirates' exports flow through it. Kuwait's exports flow through it. Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports flow through it. The economic architecture of the modern world was built in part around the assumption that this waterway would remain open. There are no easy alternative routes. There is a pipeline that runs from Saudi Arabia across the peninsula to the Red Sea, but it has limited capacity and could not absorb anything close to the full volume of Hormuz traffic. There are plans that have existed for decades to expand alternative infrastructure, but plans are not pipelines, and pipelines take years to build. If the Strait of Hormuz were closed, even for a matter of weeks, the disruption to global energy markets would be catastrophic in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate. Prices would spike to levels not seen in modern history. Economies already strained by inflation and geopolitical uncertainty would face shocks that their central banks have no tools to absorb. The ripple effects would move outward from oil markets into every connected sector of the global economy, and they would move fast. This is the weapon that Iran is now explicitly threatening to use, and the question that analysts, military planners, and policymakers are wrestling with in real time is whether Tehran actually intends to use it, whether this is a calculated bluff designed to deter further strikes, or whether the internal dynamics of the Iranian state have shifted in a way that makes the unthinkable significantly more thinkable than it was even a few months ago. The backdrop to this escalation matters enormously. Iran has been absorbing a series of significant blows over the past 18 months that have, by most serious assessments, degraded its regional position in ways that were previously considered structurally impossible. The death of key figures in its network of regional proxies, the severe degradation of Hezbollah's military capacity in Lebanon, the collapse of the Assad government in Syria, which effectively severed the land corridor that connected Iran to its most important Mediterranean ally, and a series of strikes attributed to Israel that penetrated air defense systems Iran had claimed were impenetrable. The cumulative effect of these developments has been to strip away layers of strategic depth that Iran spent decades and enormous resources building. Some analysts argue that Iran today is more isolated and more vulnerable than at any point since the early years of the Islamic Republic. Others caution that a cornered state with significant military capabilities and a leadership willing to absorb suffering in pursuit of ideological objectives is not a weakened state in any meaningful operational sense. It is a dangerous state. Within this context, the oil threat takes on a different character depending on which analytical framework you apply. If you believe that the Iranian leadership is fundamentally rational in the strategic sense, operating according to a coherent cost-benefit calculation, then the Hormuz threat is most likely a deterrence mechanism, a signal designed to raise the perceived cost of continued strikes high enough that Washington and its regional partners conclude that pressing forward is not worth the price. The logic would be, we cannot match you militarily in a direct confrontation, but we can impose costs on you and on the entire global economy that will generate political pressure powerful enough to change your calculations. From this perspective, the threat is serious, but not necessarily a precursor to action. But there is a second framework, and some analysts find it increasingly compelling. It holds that the Iranian leadership, particularly within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has concluded that the current trajectory leads to the eventual elimination of their capacity to project power regardless of what they do in the diplomatic sphere. If that conclusion has taken hold among key decision-makers, then the calculus changes. The question is no longer how do we deter further strikes while preserving our strategic position, but rather how do we impose maximum cost on our adversaries before the window to do so closes. Under that framework, the Hormuz threat is not a bluff. It is a statement of intent. The distinction matters enormously because the responses required are completely different. Deterrence logic says negotiate, communicate, find off-ramps, make clear that certain actions will not happen if certain conditions are met. Crisis prevention under the second framework requires something far more difficult and potentially far more dangerous, demonstrating credibly and quickly that any attempt to close the strait will be met with a military response so severe that it ends the threatening party's ability to carry out further threats. That is what Trump's 20 times harder statement was attempting to do. Whether it succeeds in its deterrent purpose or whether it is read in Tehran as additional evidence that Washington is committed to destroying the Islamic Republic's military capacity regardless of what Iran does next, is a question that no analyst outside the inner circle of Iranian decision-making can answer with confidence. There are reports suggesting that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been moving assets in recent weeks in ways consistent with preparation for a possible interdiction operation in the Gulf. Multiple maritime intelligence organizations have noted increased activity involving small, fast-attack craft that the Guards maintain in significant numbers across the northern Gulf. Iran also possesses a substantial arsenal of anti-ship missiles, including variants that can be fired from mobile land-based launchers along its long Gulf coastline, making them extremely difficult to neutralize in advance. The United States Navy maintains the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and has significant naval assets in the region, but interdicting Iranian anti-ship missile launches across hundreds of kilometers of coastline is a fundamentally different challenge than projecting air power from aircraft carriers, and it is a challenge that American military planners have been wrestling with for decades without arriving at a fully satisfying answer. What makes the current moment particularly volatile is the degree to which multiple overlapping crises are converging simultaneously. The nuclear question has not been resolved. Talks have proceeded in fits and starts, but the fundamental gap between what Washington demands and what Tehran is willing to accept regarding uranium enrichment has not closed in any meaningful way. According to assessments from the International Atomic Energy Agency and multiple Western intelligence services, Iran has continued to advance its nuclear program to the point where the time required to produce enough fissile material for a weapon, the so-called breakout time, has been compressed to a matter of weeks rather than months. That assessment was already driving significant pressure from Israel, which has made clear on multiple occasions that it views an Iranian nuclear weapon as an existential threat that it will take military action to prevent, regardless of American preferences. The strikes that have already occurred and that the Iranian statement explicitly references as the trigger for the oil threat are part of this larger campaign to degrade Iranian nuclear infrastructure. The problem, as several former senior officials have noted in recent commentary, is that there is no version of a military campaign to prevent Iranian nuclear weapons acquisition that ends cleanly. Every strike that degrades Iranian nuclear infrastructure also creates pressure within the Iranian system to accelerate the program, to move it deeper underground, to disperse it more widely, and to make the political decision that acquiring an actual weapon rather than maintaining the capacity to do so quickly is the only real guarantee of regime survival. The Israeli and American strikes may be buying time, but the question of what happens when that time runs out has no obvious answer. It raises an important question that goes to the heart of the strategic dilemma facing every actor in this drama. Is there a version of this situation that ends with Iran remaining a significant regional power, maintaining some form of its nuclear program below a weapons threshold, and agreeing to terms that its leadership considers consistent with the survival of the Islamic Republic as they have understood it since 1979? Or have the two sides moved past the point where such an outcome is achievable, into a space where the logic of each side's actions makes escalation more likely with every passing week? Some analysts believe that space for a negotiated outcome still exists and that the oil threat, however alarming it sounds, is actually a signal that Iran wants a deal and is trying to create enough pressure to make one happen. Others look at the same evidence and conclude that the Islamic Republic's leadership has decided that accommodation with Washington is incompatible with their continued hold on power, and that what is happening now is the beginning of a final confrontation rather than a high-stakes negotiation. The economic stakes of getting this wrong cannot be overstated, and they fall unevenly across different parts of the global system in ways that create complex political pressures. The countries most immediately exposed to a Hormuz closure are not the United States and Israel, which are driving the military pressure on Iran. They are the countries of Asia, particularly the People's Republic of China, Japan, South Korea, and India, which collectively receive the vast majority of the oil that flows through the strait. China alone imports several million barrels per day through Hormuz. A closure that lasted even a week would impose costs on China's economy that Beijing would find extremely difficult to absorb at a moment when it is already managing significant internal economic pressures. This creates a set of potential incentives for Chinese diplomatic engagement that did not exist when the primary concern was ideological alignment between Beijing and Tehran. Some analysts have argued that Washington may actually be counting on this, that one intended effect of allowing the current escalation to proceed is to create enough pressure on China that Beijing decides its interests are better served by using its considerable influence in Tehran to pull the Iranians back from the brink rather than continuing its current posture of tacit support. Whether that calculation is correct is deeply uncertain. China and Iran signed a 25-year cooperation agreement in 2021 that has deepened economic and security ties significantly. Beijing has been a major purchaser of Iranian oil, providing a crucial lifeline that has helped Tehran cope with Western sanctions. The relationship is not one that China would lightly sacrifice, but there is also a real question of how far Beijing is willing to go in defending Iranian interests when the direct cost to China's own economy and energy security becomes severe enough. The threat to block all oil exports from the entire region is, paradoxically, a threat that falls most heavily on China rather than on the Western powers that are conducting the strikes. Some observers in Beijing have reportedly been making exactly this point in internal discussions, arguing that Iran's escalatory messaging is, from a purely Chinese perspective, deeply counterproductive. There are growing concerns that the situation could tip toward accidental escalation, even if neither side actually intends a full military confrontation. The Persian Gulf is a confined body of water where American naval assets and Iranian military assets operate in close proximity on a daily basis. The history of this region includes incidents like the 1988 shooting down of an Iran Air civilian aircraft by the United States Navy cruiser Vincennes, an action taken under conditions of confusion and incomplete information that killed all 290 people on board. More recently, there have been numerous incidents involving Iranian fast boats approaching American naval vessels at close range in ways that have led to tense standoffs. In an environment where both sides have made explicit and public threats, where military assets are on heightened alert, and where miscommunication or a navigational error or a technical malfunction could be interpreted as a hostile act, the risk of an incident that neither side planned or wanted spiraling into something larger is genuinely elevated. Military planners call this the fog of crisis, and it is one of the most dangerous features of the current situation. There are possible scenarios that analysts are discussing in the days following this exchange, and they illuminate just how wide the range of outcomes remains. In the first scenario, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps statement is read correctly by all parties as a deterrent signal. Back-channel communication reestablishes some degree of understanding about red lines, and the current trajectory of limited strikes and Iranian threats reaches a kind of unstable equilibrium that neither side is happy with, but that both sides prefer to a full-scale confrontation. This scenario does not resolve any of the underlying issues. It does not prevent Iran from continuing its nuclear program. It does not end the strikes, but it avoids the worst immediate outcomes and preserves the possibility of eventual negotiation. In the second scenario, Iran concludes that its conventional deterrence is no longer credible and makes a move to demonstrate real capacity to disrupt oil flows, perhaps not a full closure, but an incident involving a tanker or a mine or a missile test that is designed to prove the threat is real. The response from Washington and potentially from other naval powers would be swift and severe, but the consequences for global oil markets would be significant, even from a limited incident. And in the third scenario, which no one wants to contemplate but which analysts feel professionally obligated to model, the situation escalates through some combination of deliberate decisions and accidental triggers into a full military confrontation that engulfs the Persian Gulf, draws in multiple outside powers, and produces consequences for global energy supply and regional stability that cascade in ways that are genuinely impossible to predict. Some analysts believe the final word on this crisis will not be spoken in Tehran or in Washington, but in the tanker lanes themselves, where the daily movement of crude oil represents both the vulnerability that Iran is threatening to exploit and the vital interest that the world's great powers have agreed, implicitly and by decades of naval policy, to protect. The United States military has, for 4 decades, made the freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf a cornerstone of its regional posture, and no administration, regardless of its broader foreign policy orientation, has ever walked back from that commitment in practice. Whether the current administration's willingness to use explicitly threatening language publicly changes the dynamics of deterrence in a useful or a dangerous direction is a question that will be answered by events, not by analysis. What happened next may reshape the energy architecture of the entire world. The statements from Tehran and the response from Washington have drawn a sharper line than has existed in years between two powers whose competition has been reshaping the Middle East for nearly half a century. Iran possesses real military capabilities, a real ability to impose real costs, and a leadership that has demonstrated repeatedly its willingness to accept significant suffering in pursuit of its objectives. The United States possesses military superiority of a kind that no other state on earth can match, but military superiority has never been sufficient by itself to produce the political outcomes that Washington has sought in the Middle East. The history of the past several decades makes that clear enough. The confrontation that these statements have brought closer to the surface is one that neither side can fully control once it begins, and the consequences of misjudgment fall not on the decision-makers, but on the tanker crews in the Gulf, on the people who heat their homes and drive their cars and run their factories on energy that flows through that 33-kilometer choke point, and on everyone whose economic life is connected, however distantly, to the price of oil. That is, in one way or another, essentially everyone on Earth. The biggest question is not whether the threats will be repeated. They will be. The question is whether someone, somewhere in Tehran or Washington or Beijing or Riyadh, finds a path out of this before the threats become actions, and the actions become a catastrophe that no one planned and no one can stop.